if we think about sort of a more common product, like a pig slurry application or a cattle slurry application, where you're putting out maybe in old money 2,000 gallons to the acre. In terms of dry matter per hectare, probably maybe about a ton or something like that of dry matter per hectare versus the 3 tons in the cover crop. In terms of the amount of dry matter going in, it's probably it's sizable for those big crops.
Even though the year has just begun, many farmers are already starting to plan their spring crops. The benefit of early sown cover crops is very clear, including strong growth, good flowering and a noticeable lift in biodiversity. All of the biomass produced is hugely beneficial for the soil, but before the next crop can be established, those cover crops need to be managed and removed effectively. There are a number of ways to deal with large canopies of cover crop biomass, but if they're not managed in good time, these can hinder successful establishment of the next crop. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Richie Hackett, a crop researcher in Teagasc Oak Park, to discuss how farmers can successfully manage and remove cover crops in preparation for the next crop. Richie, cover crops were planted quite early last year following an early harvest. This has resulted in much larger canopies. Is that what we would have expected?
Oh, I think certainly, and particularly for people that normally wouldn't get theirs sown until maybe late August or into September, and where they got them sown this year in maybe early to mid-August, those people will see a very big difference in the amount of material that are on their fields at the moment.
Do you expect those to be a bit more difficult to deal with, or I suppose maybe farmers who've never had maybe crops as big as that to deal with before?
Yeah, you'd probably require a little bit of a difficult, more different management compared to what they would have done in previous years with the extra bulk. But many people would have had big crops in the past, and those who sowed them early normally are well used to dealing with those and generally don't have a huge problem. So yes, it will require a change of management for growers that are normally used to smaller crops, but they're not insurmountable.
Before we get to there, we might just focus on the positives. I mean, I suppose the reason why these cover crops were planted in the first place was, I suppose, a number of different reasons. I suppose ignoring, the fact that there was an EIP scheme to put them in the first place, which helped in terms of cost. But cover crops are there to, grow some biomass, which there's dry matter in it. It captures nitrogen, it captures phosphorus, it captures carbon. You might just put it in terms of the canopies that are there this year, relatively big canopies, in terms of just so somebody can relate to it. If we're to compare the amount of dry matter or total material that was produced from some of these good canopies, how does that compare to, say, like an application of, say, farmyard manure or something like that?
Well, I guess I haven't done too many measurements on the actual crops that are out there, but just from eyeballing them, I think many of those crops would have, maybe 3 tons a hectare of dry matter or maybe more. And like if we think about sort of a more common product, like a pig slurry application or a cattle slurry application, where you're putting out maybe in old money 2,000 gallons to the acre, in terms of dry matter per hectare, rough, probably maybe about a ton or something like that of dry matter per hectare versus the 3 tons in the cover crops. Or if you were using poultry manures, you might be putting a little bit more than a ton per hectare out. So in terms of the amount of dry matter going in, it's probably sizable for those big crops.
And it can only be useful, I suppose, in terms of the build up in the long term of good soil health and organic matter in there. So all a positive thing, I suppose, really. But I suppose getting back to the practicalities of it, the farmers are looking at these larger canopies or thinking ahead about how to prepare for the next crop going into that. When should people be starting to think about removal or destruction, I suppose, in a general sense, of those cover crops?
I suppose there's no one date to start, but most people will be starting to think about it at the moment. Obviously, up until the beginning of the year, for some of the schemes, you weren't actually allowed to do anything with them, but you've more or less you can destroy them now when you wish. I think part of the question, part of the answer will depend on what cultivation system you have. If you're in a plough-based system, you've probably got a bit more options in terms of time. If you're in a min-till system, you probably definitely need to start that bit earlier because you want, particularly with those big crops, because you want to get that starting to break down before you go in to do any cultivation or sow, because otherwise you will just have a huge bulk of stuff there. Whereas if you're ploughing, the plough will get rid of the bulk of stuff to some degree. So yeah, for a lot of people, they will be starting to think about get going in with a herbicide at the moment in the next few weeks to start to get rid of that. The other thing I suppose you have to think about is uh, as well as getting rid of the material, the actual problem with the green bridge, where you may have a lot of volunteer cereals in these crops, as well as what you actually sowed in terms of cover crops. And they can carry, fungal diseases, or, they can act as a refuge for aphids. And if you're worried about that, then you really need to start thinking in the near future about getting rid of that material and so that those plants that have either those aphids or those funguses will start to break down, and the problem will be gone by the time you get to sow your crop, and you're reducing your risk to your next crop.
And is there any risk, Richie, in going too early that you might lose some of the benefits of the cover crop in the first place?
I would say from now on isn't too early, but if you'd gone in maybe in sort of the 1st of December, and for me, one of the main benefits of cover crops is we're all aware of the issues with nitrates in rivers, but the main benefit of a cover crop is to reduce leaching. And if you go in, say, if you'd gone in, say, on the 1st of December and sprayed off your crop, some of that nitrogen that the crop had taken up may well have been released, or is in the process of being released. And obviously, we get a lot of wet weather between now and when the following barley crop actually needs it. There's a risk of it being lost. But from now on, that risk is starting to decrease, because by the time the crop is starting to break down, that most of the rainfall will have passed.
From today, then, what would you see as the main methods of removing or destroying those cover crops? I know you mentioned herbicides already, but you might maybe just list them out first.
Yeah, well, I suppose we've all seen the frosty weather that was there last weekend, and there's probably some frost forecast in the near future as well, depending on which forecast you listen to. But what's been used quite reasonably commonly is people that go out on the frozen crop and rolling it, and that actually breaks the plant, and that acts as to kill the crop, and that can be quite successful with many of the broadleaf species. Doesn't really work with things like oats or any of the grass type ones, but that can be quite good, and obviously quite cheap. You may well have to go back with herbicide if you have a lot of volunteer cereals, because it won't do anything for your volunteer cereals either. I suppose there's always the option of grazing, particularly where you've sown a crop that's suitable for grazing, and that can be quite effective and is quite commonly used as well, and can act as an extra source of income. Then you've sort of mechanical type processes. So some people will use discs to go and sort of chop the crop, and get a small bit of incorporation into the surface soil, and that will start the breakdown process. And then there's closer to the time, you can go and plow down the crop just with. We've often done it without spraying off the crop, and just plow it down directly, and that works well. And then obviously the herbicide is. Your glyphosate herbicide is the one that will be used by a lot of people in either on its own or in conjunction with one of those previous methods that I've mentioned.
Okay, so just thinking about the grazing, and certainly bearing in mind you're not a specialist in either sheep or cattle kind of thing, but just from the point of view of sheep, I suppose, which are generally coming in to graze some of those brassica-based cover crops. It is quite popular out there. They do seem to remove a lot of the biomass there. But are there any downsides or risks associated with that? I suppose in terms of a lot of sheep being on the ground, and there's a lot of hoof prints around the place, and maybe damage to the soil from that point of view.
Yeah, well, certainly if you put a large number on a small area, you're going to lead to some soil damage, and you know you're not supposed to be doing that as part of cross compliance. But mo I think a lot of people will strip graze them to get maximum benefit from them, which will tend to help avoid that. You also people that are set up to do it will be aware of all the issues around having lie-back areas. You're required to have certain lie-back areas, which should be in place, should have been planned in the autumn before you sowed the crop. And if you haven't, you do need to consult somebody to make sure you have the correct lie-back areas and that you're not breaking any of the rules in relation to that. And then there are some issues in terms of how quickly you let the sheep in. It takes a little bit of time for the sheep to get used to eating the stuff. So, and you may need a bit of forage, such as maybe a few bales of hay or something, to give them a bit of fibre as well. And the one thing at this stage, like most people would have started grazing their brassicas before Christmas. The one thing about the very advanced crops is if they've gone into flower, it's not such a good idea to be grazing them. It can cause problems, and particularly if you're grazing with cattle, if they're gone into flower, that's a bit of a no-no.
Yeah. Yeah. So the further on the season it goes, the more careful people want to become for that. Phacelia was a very popular mix as part of many of the cover crop mixes. A lot of, from what I see around the country, at least anyway, up this part of the world, anyway, a lot of the earlier sown stuff or the larger plants have now died down or kind of pretty well rotten into the ground. So presumably there's no great feed there, or they wouldn't eat it anyways. But there's still a lot of green material left behind them, probably more so, I suppose, maybe vetches and volunteers. There's probably still a bit of value in there for livestock grazing, do you think?
Yeah, yeah. So particularly if there's vetches in there, you've a good source of protein, and if the volunteer cereals is still green and not is still growing, it can be quite a useful feed. It may be more of a sustaining feed rather than a fattening feed, but certainly a useful feed.
I suppose going back to it, and you mentioned herbicides before. I suppose glyphosate is probably going to be a relatively common option for farmers. Is there, do you think, and maybe it's dependent on system, like you said before, but say for a plough-based kind of person, is there an optimal time for application? And is there any risks that it's not going to do a complete job? Because I suppose everybody using glyphosate probably expects it to do nearly everything.
Yeah, for the plough-based system, I think you've got plenty of scope in terms of timing. Anytime now, maybe until about a week, 10 days before you actually plough. Um, for the min till, as I said earlier, you probably need to start thinking about it sooner rather than later, so you get some of that breakdown before you go in with your cultivation. As you asked in terms of the getting a kill with glyphosate, obviously if you're going out now, you're going out into quite cool conditions, slow growth, so the speed of activity of the product is going to be that much slower, and particularly with some of the cover crops. Versus say volunteers, if you go out and spray say a field with some forage rape and volunteers, the volunteers will go yellow within a week or 10 days, whereas the rape might be still green, and you might think it's not working, but if you leave it for long enough, it will work. Some of them, particularly the ones with the big roots, and I suppose the one I'm really thinking about is the tillage radish, which has a deep root. That can be quite difficult to kill with Roundup, because you've got to get the Roundup down into the root, and that can be difficult. Um, but yeah, the cultivation should help, and I have no direct experience with it, but I'm told the rolling on a frost works quite well with the tillage radish as well.
There's always a follow-up treatment, I suppose, in the spring crops as well that you probably get any remnants of it kind of thereafter. But
Yeah, so I wouldn't be overly worried about things getting through, because your sulfonylureas will do a fairly good job on that, and that does come up through
yeah,
the crop.
I know I was talking to you to this a good bit over the years, and you are, I don't know what a fan might be a bit too strong a word, but you are happy out for a direct ploughing of cover crops just directly into the ground, no need for prior cultivation or glyphosate or that. From the experience that you've had with that, is there any do's or don'ts that you would throw out to everybody here now?
Yeah, well, I suppose the first thing is if there was a lot of volunteers in there, I probably would spray it. But if you have a reasonably clean cover crop, yeah, it works pretty well. You need a reasonably well set up plough, and I would say discs on the plough are quite important because if you don't have the disc to cut it, it'll just particularly if it's something like maybe vetches that crawl along the surface of the ground, it will just start dragging and it doesn't really work that way.
So that's discs all around, as in discs on every share, if you like, rather than just
Pretty
at the back.
much, because
Okay.
if we've lost a disc in the past, and you find out very quickly that you've lost a disc,
Okay.
because it'll just start dragging on that furrow.
Okay. Very good. And it can be done relatively successfully, and the following cultivation doesn't tend to drag up anything thereafter.
Yeah, no, we've certainly never have problems, and we've ploughed down quite tall stuff, 2.5, 3 foot tall. So yeah, we found it works okay anyway.
Okay. Final question for you. So we have all this really good material. It's all there. It's all going back underneath the ground or into the ground at some stage or other. Should farmers take any allowance for that in terms of nitrogen or phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, any of that kind of stuff in terms of the release from that cover crop back into the growing crop of whatever spring crop is to be sown?
That is a difficult question. I would say for phosphorus and potassium and maybe sulfur, probably not. For the nitrogen, yes, these crops take up a lot of nitrogen, but in term any of the work that I've done trying to see how much you could reduce your fertilizer nitrogen by in the next crop, in the majority of situations, the reduction is quite small. If anything, it's quite small, and by small, I'm talking, a few kilos, 4 or 5 kilos per hectare, something like that. The one exception to that, I suppose, we found is where you've a lot of legume in there, and I mean now where the legume is the main cover, then you can get a substantial amount of nitrogen from that when it goes back into the soil, and you do need to reduce your fertilizer nitrogen. But the catch is knowing by how much to reduce it by, and that's something that we just don't have enough data on in the country at the moment. So I would say for the majority of people where they might have a little bit of vetch in it, but the amount of vetch in most cover crops mixtures I've seen is quite small, and the amount of nitrogen they're going to get back into the next crop is going to be quite small. So a lot of people, they maybe if they've got a good strong crop, they reduce their nitrogen by maybe of the order of 5 kilos, or maybe in some cases up to 10 kilos a hectare. And that I think at the moment is probably the best that we can do. And for small, if you've got small crops, small cover crops, or cover crops that are gone very stemmy, then you're probably not going to get any nitrogen worth talking back into the next crop.
A small return from that point of view, but maybe over time, Richie, that might come if there's a successive cover crops in over time, or is it still a bit unknown, if you like, from that point of view?
It can build up, but it's quite slow, and like I think we've got to remember that a lot of these cover crops lead to the build up of carbon in the soil and organic matter in the soil. And if you're locking up carbon in the soil, you by definition you're also locking up nitrogen. So even though these things have taken up nitrogen, some of that nitrogen won't actually be released back into the soil because it'll be locked up with the carbon, which is what we want to do for climate change and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, can't have everything, I suppose. Is that it?
No, but as I say, the legumes are show some promise in terms of being able to reduce your fertilizer in the next crop.
Listen, Richie, thanks very much. Thanks. That was a good update on it. There's lots of people kind of going at that over the next number of weeks, and hopefully that'll give them some pointers as regards the best options for their farms. So thanks again, Richie.
No problem. Anytime, Michael.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Richie for joining me on the show. Finally, if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with a friend or colleague, and don't forget to follow, rate and review this podcast on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, visit teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.